to our open news meeting. This is really a hybrid in that it feels like we're halfway between what we used to do, which was, by the way, since lockdown, we've actually moved offices. We're now here in Berners Street, and our old office is just down the road there in East Castle Street. But this is hybrid, so we've got a gang of us sitting around in the room here, and then I look online, and there are a whole bunch of us on the screen too. We've been doing a fair bit, as I think you'll have seen, of experimentation. We've tried Clubhouse. It's quite tricky for us because you can't quite get all the benefits of the chat. You can't see exactly what people are wanting to talk about. We've done a bit with Twitter Spaces, and we did a run the week before last, every morning at 8:30, open news meetings, which seemed to have worked really well. Mark's and Andrew's here. I'm going to talk to them in a minute about our plans for September and October. One of the things we're thinking about is taking this open news meeting on a Tuesday and putting it in a Tuesday evening so that we can actually bring people who are, if you like, in the run of news to talk to us about the issues that are happening. So today, for example, we know we're going to talk about July the 19th, the reopening, the question of masks, the risks in terms of variants and future strains, and how the government judges whether or not a future lockdown is needed. Our thinking was, well, imagine you actually had the people, some of those experts, coming into the Tortoise newsroom to discuss that on a Tuesday evening. Would that work? I'm telling you all of this because I think it'd be really handy to hear what people think about how that might work. We are, as I think you all have seen, my colleagues in particular, Matt D'Ancona and Lara Spirit, have done an amazing job in beginning to bring voices in around the arms race. And I'm going to come to Matt in a moment just to hear what we're doing, and I wanted to fill you in on how we're trying to pull that together over July and August. There are a bunch of us here. I'm going to come in a moment. I see Nimmo, by the way, if you're a regular listener to the Sensemaker, the daily Sensemaker audio, Nimmo's Sensemaker on Bill Cosby, made as close as it's possible, Nimmo, to make sense of that particularly extraordinary story, and we might come to that in a moment too. But as ever, the aim of Open News, as we saw last week, is to try and bring stories into our newsroom, either personally or digitally. So please do weigh in on that. Matt, can I just come to you, if I might, to start with? I just wanted to get a sense of, firstly, your read on the politics of Boris Johnson's decision yesterday, and then if you wouldn't mind just filling us in on where we've got to on the arms race, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Well, what Boris Johnson did yesterday had been very well flagged, and in a sense made inevitable by the departure of Matt Hancock, who was the last sort of champion of lockdowns and restrictions at the apex of government. And Sajid Javid, who's replaced him as health secretary, is, very strongly pro relaxing the restrictions, and made it categorically clear well before yesterday that they were indeed going to be lifted on July the 19th. And so the direction of travel is as follows: that the Coronavirus Act, which came into law last March the 25th in 2020, was a really striking piece of legislation, because for the first time, you were only allowed to do the things that it said you could do. The normal arrangement in the law, obviously, is law prohibits things you can't do, but the Coronavirus Act inverted that. That is now being completely unwound, and on July the 19th, with a few exceptions, all the restrictions will be lifted. We've just heard that the rule that your double jab people will not have to isolate after August the 16th, for example. So all these details are slowly unraveling. And of course, what that means is that very straightforward rules like you can't do this, you can't gather in open areas, you don't have to wear a mask, are suddenly being delegated to individuals. And that's why there is so much kind of rowing and argument today about masks on social media and in broadcasting, and no doubt across the kitchen table. Let's sort of look at exactly the opposite scale of the panorama, the whole planet. A very, very different picture emerges. And it's the picture that we're trying to address in our arms race campaign, and you kicked off with your brilliant slow newscast yesterday about the failure of the G7 to address the question of global vaccination. And we're following that up this week with a series of pieces by well-known people, ranging from politicians like Caroline Lucas and Jeremy Hunt to celebrities like Emma Corrin and Emma Kennedy, the writer Elif Shafak, and so on. And they're trying to add some personal and moral weight to the case that we believe is extremely powerful, unarguable, that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that's become almost a cliche, but it really is an instance where humanitarian argument completely converges with enlightened self-interest. Because if we leave the poorer nations of the world unvaccinated, the virus will mutate into variants that will sooner or later come back to the West and the wealthier nations in forms that will achieve what they call vaccine escape. In other words, the vaccines that we've had will be less effective and possibly totally ineffective against them. So this is not just about charity or philanthropy or morality. It's also about saving ourselves. And the risk, I think, at this point is that we're going to be very introspective as the cases of the Delta variant rise as they are already in this country, possibly, Sajid Javid said today, to 100,000 cases a day. The natural instinct will be to think about the domestic situation. But if we don't keep our eyes firmly on the international situation as well, all the efforts we make within the borders of the UK will be as naught.
Matt, I want to, if I can, just hijack this, well, not hijack it, but just stick on this for a second, because the truth is, we're a pretty small group that's been thinking about this question. So you, as I mentioned, Lara Spirit, Tess Murray, who's here, Andrew Butler, who I think is somewhere on the screen, who's been thinking about how we do social media. I think it's just worth being honest with everyone, sort of Tortoise colleagues and Tortoise members, around the 4 different issues we're facing around trying to build a public campaign, right? So there are some campaigns that are quite easy because they're very, very rooted in a single place, right? And often that really works quite well, or they're very time bound. That also works quite well. Or to be honest with you, you're actually campaigning for something that you already know is going to happen. That's the best kind of campaign, right? You're then just kind of pushing for something. The door will eventually open, as you know it would. This one, what we're trying to work out is, I suppose, 4 things. One is, are we right to make the argument in the first place? Is this just a reaction to the current state of vaccinations, or is it really the case that the global vaccine rate is an acute problem this summer and is likely to be an ongoing problem into 22, 23, 24, right? And actually, I think it's worth reflecting back to kind of colleagues and Tortoise members that everything we hear is it's a big problem getting worse. The problem from COVAX, from Gavi, from WHO, all the people who deliver these vaccines say, we started off in February pretty confident. By now, by beginning of July, we're nearly 300 million vaccines short of where we need to be this summer, right? We really wanted 1 billion for these next few months. At the moment, we're not going to get the full 1 billion that were promised in Carbis Bay by until the end of next summer. So actually the argument, I think the case for the campaign is really strong. The thing that we've been really trying to wrap our heads around is, what is the ask? What do we want from people? So the question is here, what's the public ask? Do we want to ask the public to pledge doses? Do we want the public to pledge their support, i.e., digitally? Is it a hashtag? How do we do that? What do we want business to do? Right, at the moment, we're talking about how do they match doses. What do we want the pharmaceutical companies to do? Because the pharmaceutical companies are increasingly going to be in the crosshairs on this. And what do we want government to do? And so the aim over the next 4 to 6 weeks is to try and focus really clearly on exactly what that ask is, so that we can have multiple launches. As we've seen this week, I think we've come out and said, look, hey, we're trying to build a campaign, who will join us? And we've had an amazing response so far, but we want to see who joins us over the next 6 weeks. So as you get to the end of August, you begin to go into the UN General Assembly, the whole pre-prep for the G20, and you're really planning around that. But then the really key question is, and the other thing we're trying to work out, is a small team, right? I was speaking to Richard Curtis at the end of last week. He was saying they built Make Poverty History with a team of about 6 to 10 people. That's all you actually need in terms of a key team of people, but they've got to be involved all the time. And then on top of that, you need a coalition of different coalitions, media, business, tech, and we're trying to build all of that. So I mention all of that because some of the people I know on this call are sort of thinking about how they can get involved. That's where we are. I don't know, Tess, do you want to come in on this, on where we've got to so far?
This is an absolutely enormous mic.
Yeah, it's an enormous mic, which let's just double check whether it's working.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Like a Wimbledon reporter. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the scale of it has, or the sort of tendrils of it, we've realised, haven't we, spread very far and wide. So bringing it in to this coalition of coalitions within different verticals is the plan over the summer. I suppose this story is only going to build and it's only going to get worse. And I think we are ahead of the curve in terms of, because of the luxury and the proximity of the people we get to talk to. I think we are more cognizant of what is really happening and how great a risk that is on a global scale. So if we can get a jump on getting the right people in the room over the next 4 to 6 weeks and hit the ground really hard in September, that's gonna be good. There is already some anecdotal stuff coming through off the back of your voicemail yesterday. I don't know if you saw the email from Andrew a moment ago, just saying that the manager of a GP practice has seen 30% of people not turning up for their second doses. We're already seeing wastage within the UK system, and one of the things we talked about is share the spares. So if we get a combination of sort of vaccine laziness rather than hesitancy in the UK, combined with low vaccination in the global context, and I think we're cruising for some real trouble. So the sooner we get onto this, the sooner we raise visibility. The Director General of WHO yesterday called for 3 billion in Paris. This is getting on the agenda. I think we can do our bit to push it up.
Thank you. And I just want to get a tip from Lucy, if I might, Lucy Huberman, just because you said, Lucy, the pattern of kind of bringing in big organisations. We've talked, Lucy, to a fair few, right? So and the whole principle has been we're going to work with everyone, right? So will you just tell us a little bit about the example you've got about how best to do this?
I don't know about best practice, but can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you good.
But yes, well, a few people started campaigning for some kind of remembrance for COVID, for families of people who'd lost loved ones to COVID in September. That was 6 months before the Day of Remembrance. It was a much, in a way, smaller campaign than I think you're about, but in the sense only that we were only limiting ourselves to the UK at that point. And the stragglers, as it were, got together, and Mary Curie came forwards as an anchor, which is what you're doing. Because of their name, other people took confidence in the campaign that wouldn't have joined in before. The church, which is mega in the UK for this kind of thing, then I think Parliament, and then when the PM joined in, I must say I wasn't sure if that was good or bad, but it turned out to be quite good. And it was actually a very, very well coordinated campaign led by a very, very small team of people. But we had weekly updates. I was in weekly meetings with the growing network of people who contributed from the base of their own organization. So Mary Curie quite cleverly didn't do everything. They had the central comms, marketing, digi-marketing, and TV campaigns, because they're a big national charity. They've got a lot of expertise in that area. They have less grassroots. So there were many grassroots organizations involved, and we met every week. We fed in, and it was all pulled together, and lo and behold, it happened. There are different models. So, but I think obviously your question is, what is the ask? I think you have to get that sorted first. I posted a link to an article in Nature this week, which said that the poorest countries wouldn't be vaccinated until 2023, even with all the stocks and all the mechanisms that still exist.
So we spoke, Lucy, in the course of last week, we spoke to Peter Sands, who runs the Global Fund, Gavi, the WHO, UNICEF. They're worried it slips to 2024 at current rates. And what they talk about, which we didn't get into in the course of the podcast, are things like product vaccine hesitancy, i.e. the issue that, certain countries are now saying we don't want to take AstraZeneca, which is a massive problem for COVAX, because they say, well, AstraZeneca, not only do we have the production lines, there's not the production lines available for Pfizer, but the cost is a fraction of what Pfizer is, even before you get to the distribution and storage issues.
I think you're going to run into immense amount of politics, James, that you will have to sort out that is nothing to do with the reality. And I'll just suggest one person privately that you should speak to, who seems to be an absolute whiz, who's not in any big organization, but can.
Who's that?
He's called Vishal Gulati.
Okay.
All right, I'll send you a note.
Really, will you send it? That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
So that's...
But the AZ, is most of the original AZ issues with the EU were political, to do with Brexit.
Yeah.
The secondary issues, the manufacturing and distribution, the pipeline and the logistics. With a campaign, all of that can be. Those aren't impossible to resolve.
No, I don't. Look, I don't think. Firstly, I don't think we should have.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lucy, were you saying?
I'm not an expert.
No, and nor are we. And look, part of our thing is to say, look, we're a small new startup. We're just figuring out how to, in effect, tie our own shoelaces. We shouldn't have kind of great, presumptions about what we can do in the world, but we can keep doing what Matt says, is keep doing journalism on this subject. There's something about just keeping after the same story that in itself is incredibly valuable. And we can also begin to convene. That's the one thing we've shown we are really good at, is bringing people together. And if we can do that, we can then hopefully build some momentum around this particular campaign. And it feels to me as though if we're true to what we said we were going to be about at Tortoise, which is not just tell the story, but take an interest in what happens next, if we're not going to do this about this particular subject, it seems odd to think what we would do it about. So I suppose I say that because I'm really struck in the last couple of weeks at how easy it is to get derailed from something like this, just because, as you say, it's political, it's complicated, it's international, it's expensive, it's exhausting, but it is also an argument for being bloody minded. So I suppose that's going to be the approach to on it. Yelena, just to say, we haven't lost this idea of the twin cities. Katie's idea of an arms race where you're competing different towns across the UK to say who can you help in different towns across the world. So we're definitely not losing that. Just in the spirit of kind of giving people a heads up of where we're going on the journalism with this. As Matt kindly pointed out, I did a podcast this week on what actually happened at the G7. Why did the Prime Minister say we're going to get everyone together to commit to jabs by the end of 2022 rather than 24-25, and still we're stuck in that timetable and not get the 22 that we hope for. But Kerry's at the different end of the story. And Kerry, I don't know whether you're there just to say, I know you're downstairs in the basement, just so Kerry's downstairs in the basement trying to script next week's podcast. This 3-minute burst, Kerry, on what you're doing, counts as a break.
Thank you, Jake. Look, here we go. That's what I'm doing. I won't let you read it. Mad scribbling is what I'm doing. So I am looking at, I think I've come to think today that what I'm really trying to understand is why, so I'm looking at the origins of COVID in Wuhan in 2019, which has obviously become a massively contested thing and probably surprised us by becoming more controversial since Joe Biden took office than arguably it was even sort of towards the tail end of Donald Trump's time. And I think the question I'm sitting here sort of wrestling with today is why it is that probably one of the most eminent British scientists in this field said to me yesterday that he thinks the most likely thing is that we'll never know the answer. That you've got these two competing theories, animal transfer theory on the one side, that this virus came in the way that every other virus in history has come, which is from animal transfer through bats and other animals into humans. And competing with that, you've got the lab leak theory. And we can all feel the kind of ground shifting between those two arguments in favor, I think you'd say, of the lab leak theory over the last several months. But still, this growing possibility that we're never going to know the answers either way. And is that because the world blew what may have been its single best chance of getting an answer, which was the World Health Organization mission to Wuhan in the early part of this year? So I've been looking very closely at that, talking to people who are on that trip, trying to figure out whether the WHO let us down in the way that it agreed the terms of reference for that mission. Did it allow its scientists to go in a way that never really gave them a chance of getting to the truth? Did it drop the ball by allowing a team which had clear conflicts of interest within it to go in? Did the team on the ground apply different standards of evidence, proof to different theories that they had? Did they apply a lower standard of proof to the idea that COVID had come about through frozen food than it did to the lab leak theory, for example? And in sort of big terms, was science bullied by politics? Did science become political? How did we get to this point where we tragically may never know the answer to this really important question?
And Kerry, can I ask you, how much is it? I'm struck by Lucy's comment actually about, if you find out, all that's going to do is create, let's say it is a lab leak. Let's say you did find out there was a lab leak. The risk, and Matt talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the risk is that just escalates an already tense US-China relationship. How much do you think there is a concerted effort not to find out?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't come across that. It's certainly the case that people are tremendously worried about what would happen if you did find out. And I think a lot of people think it's a finely balanced judgment whether, for example, if you're in Wuhan, almost certainly you have tightened up your procedures within your laboratory, whatever happens. So you could argue that the additional benefit of being able to pin the blame on a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology might be marginal, and the losses could be enormous, because you've got politicians in the United States talking about reparations. I haven't come across anybody who said that there's a deliberate, concerted effort to kind of in the West to not find out, because I think we'll get the results, or we'll get some sort of output from the intelligence investigation that Joe Biden announced back in May in the next month or two, and I don't assume that will be deliberately downplayed in order to come up with no answer rather than whatever answer it finds.
The thing that interests me about this too is the extent to which there will be a pattern, as with so many other things, there will be a pattern of people's beliefs, right? I.e. the way they vote, what they think about values and lab leak animal transfer. Is there any polling on this? Is there any, I know it's to poll people who don't have any information about a story of which there is a lack of information, but is there any polling, Kerry?
I've got a lack of information on that. I haven't seen it.
I just personally am aware of the fact that I was very happy to essentially subscribe to the animal transfer argument this time last year, and now, for a whole host of reasons, I'm one of those people who's drawn to lab leak. I've got no more evidence this time now than I did this time last year. But it's going
to be like everything else in the world, isn't it, Joe? It's going to end up mapping to Brexit in the end. It's the thing for sure.
There's going to be that. All right. Well, listen, Kerry. I hope this felt like something of a breather from that impossible business of scripting. It's a very weird thing, scripting a podcast, because it's not like writing an op-ed or an article. You're trying to tell, particularly a story. Maybe we'll come back and do that another time, because it's something we're trying to learn as we go. How do you do something that is narrative, investigative journalism? Before we come to the sort of main subject we wanted to talk about, which was what people think of the changes in the rules and the implications for life, work, schools, the winter, I just wanted to just check in with Basha coming for a second, because If you'd had a chance to listen to Left to Die, the Escape from Amarula, that slow newscast from last week, or the week before last, one of the things that we're beginning to see is conversations with TV and film production companies, and I just thought it'd be useful for everyone just to know about how that process works and where that might take us, possibly nowhere. It might not get any more glamorous than the conversation I'm about to have with Basha. But Basha, what's actually going on there?
So I described it yesterday to Kerry, like I'd sort of been on a lot of dates in the last couple of weeks, which is where people, so we published this series and because it's such a sort of cinematic story in many ways, it seemed like an obvious one that, you know, production companies got in touch to say, are the rights available? Would you be open to considering developing either a documentary or a sort of film proposal? And you get these emails and you think, oh yeah, brilliant, okay, fantastic. And then you realize that actually they're sort of sounding you out. They're trying to figure out if you're interesting and smart and, you know, and you're sort of doing the same thing. And so, yeah, you sort of feel like you're kind of doing this weird professional dating about a story and whether there's a kind of creative partnership there. And so I've had a few of those meetings, not just on that story, but on various other things that we've done over the last sort of 6 months. And I think the thing that's really clear is that we made a decision, James, Kerry, Katie, all of us, I think it is about 6 months ago, that we were going to do this thing that you've just talked about, James, thinking about investigative journalism in a narrative way. And how do you tell stories that will bring people in who might not normally sit down and read a big sort of Sunday Times investigation? Or how do you expand that audience and do it in a way that uses audio? And what's so clear from all of this sort of incoming interest is that we share the same DNA now with film and TV production companies. We're thinking about characters and the jeopardy that they face and the beginning, middle and end and all those things that lots of these people who are involved in a different industry to us look at and go, oh yeah, that feels like something that we can work with. So I think we're in a really interesting place, and I don't know if these dates are going to go anywhere. A couple of them seem to be going well. I'll let you know if anything comes out of it. But yes, that's sort of where we are at the moment.
From the Bumble front line of news. Thank you. Thanks, Basha. Listen, I just wanted to say that I've dropped the ball on a couple of things. Louise Simpson mentioned this question of whether or not there's a song in there. Actually, fun enough, Louise was in touch with Tim Rice, who, I don't know whether you'd seen, wrote that choral piece, G7, to see whether or not there's something there. But you're right, there's definitely going to have to be something in that world that's much more, frankly, tuneful and enjoyable than just Tortoise journalism that's going to get us there. So we're thinking about something on the music front. I did want to just bring in Nico MacDonald for a second, because Nico's making a point about broader kind of internationalism, and I think there's a risk, Nico, in the point you're making, which is that, frankly, this all might be very worthy and well-meaning, but the world has generally proved that it doesn't care.
Yeah, I do. I'm just responding to Tessa's comments in the chat. I pointed out that smallpox was eradicated in the UK in the 1930s, but not in the world until 1980. And in fact, David Olusoga's and Stephen Johnson's recent show, Extra Life, demonstrated that very well. We seem to ignore communicable diseases in the developing world, and things like dysentery and very basic things which kill children particularly, but kill many people, that would be very economically feasible to deal with, not least with development. And the one communicable disease that we've really been preoccupied about in the last 30 years is AIDS. And two things about that's because it affects people, or it did affect people significantly in the developed world. So there seems to be some bad faith here. And it just feels like there's a sort of sense of care expressed in, no one will be safe till everyone is safe. But actually that care, if you really look at it, doesn't actually seem to be there in the underlying culture of our relationship to the developing world. And it seems to be, and this is complete speculation, but maybe this is the modern form of moral imperialism that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years since Blair's, Chicago speech. And we'll start to use vaccines as a way of intervening in the developing world and perhaps challenging China's increasing influence in the developing world. I don't know, it's complete speculation, but it just seems there's rather a lot of bad faith here, disguised as philanthropy.
Well, there is that, and there's definitely the vaccine diplomacy. I don't know whether you saw that story on the Seychelles and the extent to which the Sinopharm vaccine was, had played into that. I think there is that. The interesting thing is, I had a conversation with someone who worked with the Gates Foundation around this, the arms race, around the idea of, how much do you get G7 countries to give? And it's quite interesting. There is a kind of second-guessing, saviour complex reluctance to weigh in on this. But on the other hand, the reality is it is the G7 countries that are going to have to find the funding to deliver on this ACT accelerator. So, I find myself worrying a little bit this becomes an excuse for inaction, but I completely see what you mean. So I think it is a really interesting element of it. I'm going to do one thing, which just to put Connor and Phoebe through their paces. So the scene here, just so you know, is it's a horrible day outside. We're sitting in the newsroom. It's grey and wet, and we see people being blown from their umbrellas and looking in our newsroom thinking, what are we doing? Just to give you all who are watching a sense, and partly so we can test whether it works, I just want to give us go around and check in with people in the room. So I'm going to start with Mark St Andrew. Mark, who is busy. We've had a meeting this morning planning our September-October think-in schedule. Do you want to just talk through what we're doing, and then to give people a heads up, I'm going to check in with Kira, what she's doing, Nima, what you're doing, Lizzie, what you're up to today, Shira too. So I'm going to check in with everyone. Mark.
Right, so yes, think-ins are going to, we're going to take a short break over August to give everyone a bit of a rest and to enjoy what's left of the summer. And then we'll be back on the 1st of September, and we're going to change the schedule slightly. So think-ins will be back in the newsroom, but you will still be able to watch them remotely. So they'll be kind of like this hybrid model.
And you can watch and also speak in.
You can watch and speak in, just like you're doing now. Yeah. They will be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the big headline is that the open news session now will move to Tuesday evening, and then our regular thinking program will be Monday, Wednesday, and Thursdays. And we've got some people already lined up. So we're expecting Caitlin Moran in September. Stephen Pinker will be in the newsroom. We're working on a really meaty one about the end of the tobacco industry with British American Tobacco. We will have Mark Drakeford back, who had to
British American Tobacco, they're going to come?
Yeah, I've been promised Kingsley Wheaton. I mean, I can ask, yeah. And then we're looking to kind of get a little bit more controversy into the programme. So we're talking to some people who will bring that. It's London Tech Week in September, so there will be a lot of tech-flavoured things, but accessible tech as well as niche interest tech. We're talking about ethics, AI and data, but there'll also be some slightly more accessible ones as well, for people who maybe tech isn't going to be all and end all. And we have our Cyber Summit at the end of September about cybersecurity. So it'll be here before we know it, and we'll be starting to announce dates in about 2 weeks' time.
So just on that, so Mark, thank you. Louise Simpson says, how about Alex Younger? Which is a good idea. We've talked a fair bit, Louise, about spooks, i.e. how do we get into the world of espionage? Actually, this evening's thinking is with a guy called Kieran Martin, who is the Don of cybercrime. If you want to know about the weaponization of the internet and people who are doing dastardly things with cryptocurrency and bots and, fakery and fraud of all kinds, Kieran Martin's the person for that. So he's coming. But part of the aim of these open news meetings, and part of the aim of what we're trying to do this summer, is give ourselves time to book that season. So if you've got thoughts, please do just message me or message Mark. All right, Kira, hello. What are you doing here? What are you working on? Here, take a mic.
Yeah, hello. So yeah, I'm on the community network team here, and I think one of the most exciting things I've been working on is I've been helping Duncan Mavin, who I think is on the call.
There he is.
Yes, there he is. He's moving back home to Newcastle for him, back up to the northeast, and I'm helping him with Tortoise expanding. to the northeast area. So I'm doing a lot of outreach and working with organizations and charities in the area, and just trying to get Tortoise set up out there. So
that's fantastic. Okay,
that's
cool.
what
Thanks
I'm
a lot.
doing.
Duncan, do you want to tell us how that's going? Is he there?
Yeah. Yeah. So we're moving along as fast as we can. This is an idea I think James, you and Katie had a little while ago about how we can take a sort of Tortoise approach to local news, which I think is really sensible. And so we're approaching lots of organizations up here and individuals to say, well, what would Tortoise look like if we did it in the Northeast? What would be the right mix and the right cadence of our coverage? And I think we're sort of pushing on open doors, to be quite honest. People are really sort of crying out for that for a sensible approach to news in the local area. So far it's been very healthy. I think it's early days, as they say, but we're getting a lot of positive feedback so far.
Okay, well, Duncan, I think we talked, didn't we, about actually having a think-in that would sort of encourage all of our members to get together and say, what do you think a kind of Tortoise Metro would look like? Is that still on the cards?
Yeah, in fact, I think we'll aim for at least one, maybe a couple, right. And maybe look to different communities in the region. But yeah, part of, I guess, consistent with everything Tortoise has been about already, is looking for lots and lots of ideas and feedback from our members and would-be members in the region to say, well, what would you like to see from us?
Okay. Okay, well, I look forward to that, because part of the argument has been that the old, if you like, pillars of local journalism, things like traffic news, sports news, weather, so much that been automated, but is there a version of a slower news and a more open news that could work there? So let's I look forward to hearing what people say. Nimo, do you want to just say what are you working on?
Yeah, so I'm working on a few things right now. So I'm working on a slow view that's coming out hopefully in the next few weeks about modern slavery, forced labor, and NHS supply chains. So I've been researching basically about how forced labor within PPE, so medical gloves in which largely come from Malaysia, which have huge issues with forced labor and modern slavery, have ended up in NHS supply chains basically, and how the reason why I got alerted to it was because a law firm has basically kind of written an open letter to the Department of Health, Social Health, basically saying that, like, this is happening, we know it's happening, we're representing people who are in Malaysia right now, migrant workers primarily, who are basically in these like debt bondages and in abhorrent working conditions. These medical gloves, huge contracts worth like millions and millions of dollars, have ended up in NHS hospitals. What are you going to do about it?
And what response do they get? No response.
They haven't gotten a response, to the best of my knowledge.
I'm imagining they call us at the point they get no response from anyone else.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's really interesting, and kind of particularly as the UK has basically been talking about with our new legislation about modern slavery that we did in 2015. It's like, what actually how basically looking at the efficacy of it, and then this news story that we might be pursuing after our open news meeting last week, about Coventry and crime rates and gang activity. I'm kind of pursuing that as well right now.
The Coventry story. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks very much. And Lizzie, what are you up to today?
Thank you. So predominantly at the moment, having joined 2 weeks ago, so my update will probably be briefer than others. Building off what Mark said about the cyber summit that's coming up in September, I'm working with Alexandra, who's hiding somewhere in the office at the moment, and potentially is on the call, building off the relationships built for the AI network, which the first forum was held in June, and there's been a significant amount of interest off the back of that internationally. So there are some partners and members coming along to some events in the next couple of weeks, and lots of opportunity and interest in building that out further. So there's a web page linked to it on the Tortoise site.
On the Cyber Summit?
Not yet on the Cyber Summit, but on the AI network, and shortly on the Cyber Summit. So yes, if anyone's on this call and interested in the world of AI, I have to admit to being less knowledgeable about it than the others that I've been speaking to in the past week. But there's a huge amount of events coming up in the next 6 months or so.
I was once told that an expert is the person who knows the most about any subject in that particular room, and by this,
that's me then.
That's either a great sign for you and a worrying sign for us, but that's what it is. And Shreya, what are you working on?
I'm working on ANZ, so I'm trying to find coalitions that we can have with different.
Just to explain to everyone what ANZ is, if they are, because that's our shorthand.
Accelerated Net Zero.
Yeah.
We're coming up to COP 26, which is happening in November, and I've been speaking to a lot of companies. Quite strangely, on my commutes, I've been meeting people who work in companies doing accelerating net zero, which has been fun.
So what do? You just stop people on the tube? I'm totally in favour of that, by the way. I think that's not a bad thing.
Drive them with cake. No, it's just been strange. People just start conversations like, "What do you do?" And because a lot of the work I've been doing has been on ANZ, and I'm just like, yeah, like I'm working towards ANZ and find like partnerships, and they're like, oh, we do a lot of stuff, and then people are very happy to talk about what their companies are doing. So it's been a good
that's amazing
networking skill.
Yeah.
In the most random places. So yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I had my formative experience as a reporter was working with this guy, David Broder. We're not working with him, like just sort of following behind him. He was a watching person. He always had that great thing of asking people this open question of what's on your mind. And he'd ask anyone, just stop anyone and ask them. And it would always, lead stories. So it's incredibly revealing. All right, well, listen, that's good. I've left us too little time to discuss probably the argument that most people are having today, which is, have they done the right thing on reopening? I'm just going to go to, I wonder if I can just get a read from Giles Whittell on that for a second. Giles, I don't know whether you're there, or because it seems to me as though the question that it's left hanging is whether or not we've sort of abandoned the old numbers, the old infection numbers, even hospitalization numbers, and think that we've got, if you like, a new relationship with this virus.
I thought you were going to ask me about Afghanistan, but
I was going to ask you about that too, but I'm going to do that. But I've been kept on promising that we'll get to July the 19th.
Yeah, well, very briefly, I think what's striking is the difference between the way we're being asked to look at the pandemic domestically by our own government and the way the country is currently viewed quite reasonably by the rest of the world, which looks first at the prevalence and only secondarily at the vaccination levels, because we are a source of infection now. I mean, it is true, and I would recommend Tom Whipple's analysis in today's Times that the link appears to be almost broken, not entirely, but I've spoken to doctors who are deeply concerned about the worst case scenario. And on this, I draw your attention to Paul Karani-Galizia's map in today's SenseMaker, which shows very low levels of uptake in some of our urban cores. And if you have low uptake, high infection rates, some of which do lead to hospitalization and death, albeit a small number, but also to long COVID, then you have a long-term domestic problem. And if you open up, as we're going to do on the 19th domestically, and then proceed to badger the rest of the world as we have been to let us resume international travel, we become, as I say, a source of infection to the world. That's my response to the press conference of yesterday.
And Charles, what I don't understand is, and maybe this is, and maybe no one understands it yet, is if you are forecasting an infection rate rising to 100,000 cases, and that translates to a hospitalization rate of 1 to 50, so 2,000 odd cases a day, and that accumulates, right? And I don't know how long a hospital stay is, on average, is thought to be, but that does begin to have a real impact, doesn't it, going into the autumn on NHS capacity. So this idea of we're not going to overwhelm the NHS. Well, not in the same way, but it is going to continue to have an impact on backlog, isn't it?
Yes, treatment has improved though. Politico ran an interesting piece that I linked to yesterday. They ran it last week, quoting Liz Lightfoot, I think her name is, a renal specialist at Imperial, saying, bottom line is, if you get it and you get it badly enough to go to hospital, you are mercifully much, much less likely to require intensive care than last year, and much, much less likely to die. So there are no silver bullets. I mean, we all know that they're using dexamethasone, they're using oxygen in slightly different ways, they're pronating quicker, that kind of thing. But you're presumably right that they're looking at a spike in cases in the NHS as the summer progresses. But they hope that it won't clog the ICU units. But it is a gamble. We all know it's a gamble.
I'm going to try and get Paul, by the way, Giles, because I think he's lurking. Is he lurking behind? Okay, I'm going to go and get him in a second, because
hunt him down.
Yeah, I will do, because I think. Let me just see if he's here. 1 second. Let me see. Paul, do you have 2 secs? He's just coming. I tell you the reason why is I just think that I think there's a risk. You get to go on the blue sofa with a. So this is like one of those game show moments where you come through the door and we ask you a bunch of questions. So today's sense maker. It's quite good, isn't it?
Thanks, James.
No, seriously. I tell you what. The reason I want to dive into it is, I don't know. Not everyone will have read it. It just looks at the unbelievable range of vaccination rates, and I just wanted to work out where you got the data from, where you got the idea from, what it says, and you think it's important.
So the idea came after hearing Boris Johnson repeatedly saying, look, we can lift restrictions on the 19th of July because at least 86% of England's population has received the first dose. But when you break down that aggregate number into what are effectively neighborhoods, you see this really wide range.
And how do you do that?
So the data are provided by the government itself.
It is provided by what? By postcode or by borough?
Well, they're a statistical unit called middle super output areas, and each one contains at most 7,000 residents. So there are close to 7,000 in England.
So 7,000 middle, what are they called? Middle super output?
Middle super output areas. So anyway, so you can at that level record the uptake of first and second vaccine doses. And the range is from something like 28.6% somewhere in Gloucestershire to 93% somewhere in Northumberland. But the really interesting feature of the data are this wide gap you see between urban and rural areas. And for some reason, I expected urban areas to have higher uptake, but it's actually the reverse. So the big cities, so London, Birmingham, Sheffield, Liverpool, Newcastle, will have very low uptakes. And it's hard to say, but if you do a kind of rough model of the data, what you'll see is that the kind of biggest determinant of uptake is actually the share of women in a population. Incomes.
So more women in
more women, more higher uptake. More women, more vaccines. More money, more vaccines. So higher income levels are associated with higher uptake. And then things which are really strongly negatively associated with uptake are the population shares of Black and Asian ethnic groups. So the uptake among those groups is really low. And then uptake among young people is really low, but that's probably a function of the rollout program, which obviously prioritized older people first.
So and just, can you explain the income, the household income? Do you get household income for these?
For these units, so the MSOAs. So everything is measured at that unit level. So it would be the average household income in that unit, in that neighborhood, say. And then everything else would be, for example, 40% of this neighborhood's population is Asian or Black or whatever. And those are the kind of, a short list of variables we check the data against.
And is there, so the line that does kind of, as you say, staggering, is that the range is from 28.6% in Tiddenham and Wollaston, Gloucestershire, as you say, the same rate as Cambodia, to 93.3% in Morpeth, in Northumberland. So is it possible that the 7,000 odd people in Tiddenham and Wollaston have gone somewhere else for their vaccines, or they would be measured because of where they're resident?
No, it's possible. And in fact, in that specific case, although statistically it's really hard to measure, it's likely that a lot of them got their vaccine somewhere in Wales. So this is English data.
Oh, I see.
So it wouldn't measure that.
But presumably you're measured by your NHS number, so you're measured where you're resident, not where you received your vaccine.
Presumably, but it's one explanation for that.
Oh, I see.
For that low rate. But although that is the lowest, the kind of jump to the next lowest isn't that great. So it's something like 30%. So there are parts of Sheffield where it's 30%, or parts of London where it's 30%.
Right. Sorry, Tess, you were going to say?
I was just going to say this point that Sav made in the chat about people not showing up for booked vaccines because they're perhaps going to walk-in centres. So, trying to work out what's really going on with the vaccination rates. Are we not capturing the real vaccination rates because people are just rocking up to walk-in centres, and it looks like they're not turning up for second doses, but they just sort of junk them because they're getting their second dose somewhere else? I wonder if we can unpick that, because, what is the real vaccination level in the UK, and how can we get a more
I think
robust
it's really,
view
I
of
think
it?
it's really hard to measure. I think on walk-in centres, I think they started quite recently, I don't know how long. So they started quite recently. I don't know how many there are. I mean, what I think you can say with confidence is that the availability of walking centres isn't enough to explain that range. Whether you can accurately measure that effect, I don't know. Certainly not with the data the government provides.
But what that suggests, doesn't it, is that you're going to have communities and geographies where you are going to have these surges, and then you're going to have community responses, and you're going to think about who you support financially as they go into cycles of staying at home.
I think that's right. The awkward thing about it is public health policy, at least the way Boris Johnson has been discussing, is national.
Yeah.
But that would only work if the distribution of vaccine uptake data were random. So where it isn't kind of really concentrated in specific areas, because that then means you need different policy responses for different areas, as you said.
I just want to pick up on a couple of points. Paul, thank you. Sorry to point you out. I don't know what you were doing, but just wait, because there may be a couple of people who've got thoughts on this. I want to just hear from Andrew Girdwood, who's just in Scotland. I know we've been talking a lot about the NHS in England. So, Andrew, I don't know what you make of this situation, because it feels as though we're back to one of those things that we had in the summer of last year, where the UK is kind of very differently governed.
And it feels even worse than before. I mean, if I was Manchester, I think a couple of weeks ago, I was threatening to demand, money back from Sturgeon for banning travel. But I think if I was running Manchester now, I'd be building a wall and say, you infectious Scots, keep out. It's so bad up here right now. Not that it feels that way. And that's the reason why. The sun's been out for 2 weekends in a row and everybody is mingling. And I think the breaking news now is that NHS region declaring code black. Well, that's the word that the journalists were using, just to demand. And it's crazy, right? How can you have any semblance of control if you literally can't control? We go vaccine passports presumably coming, but do we need one to cross the border internally? Because it is a devolved issue.
Yeah, I mean, the whole geography of this, actually, I was just asking Dave Taylor, my colleague in the chat. Dave, what do you think about this? Because there's something, I mean, it's like, when you put it on the page, Paul, it's incredibly obvious, but I hadn't thought of it at all, I'm embarrassed to say. Dave?
Obvious thing to do once you've got the numbers that Paul's got is go and get the human stories, isn't it? And so I suppose, I mean, he cited Morpeth as a good example. You want to be surely going and talking to people in Morpeth to find out what the behaviour patterns are and what the attitudes are that lie behind the data. And again, I mean, Duncan up in his new digs in the northeast, we've sort of talked about already what's the force multiplier that the Tortoise can be in the northeast. There's journalism everywhere is under pressure, but there are loads of vibrant newsrooms still in the northeast. All the big towns and cities have got an established presence, and it'd be sort of wonderful if you could be taking the model where we're pretty good at convening conversations. If you could start to bring newsrooms together and say, well, look, if there is an issue that we all passionately care about, but we feel like we lack the reporting muscle to do shoe leather, what if we collaborated? I mean, I can really see, again, Paul had an early success for Tortoise, didn't he, when he did something around prescription drug rates and really got into an incredible social story in the northeast on that. It seems like there's something here that you could replicate that type of granular reporting, but benefit from not forgetting that it affects real people. And I'd love to see what you can do with collaborations. There's some really innovative stuff going on in that space.
And I'm really struck by that. The thing that I was listening to Sajid Javid this morning, I was thinking, you remember that moment when Matt Hancock talked about the NHS sort of throwing its arms around the social care system, and today this kind of talk about the kind of ring of steel of the vaccine, the way in which the national defences have been put in place. Actually just looking at your sense maker, I was thinking, well, it's obviously a very, very patchy set of defences, and actually trying to figure that out and report that out seems like a really interesting thing to do. So let's take, continue on that front. Just a note to say thank you, Nico, on the point about how we make these hybrid things work as quick, as effectively as possible. As you've seen, we're just learning, or I'm particularly learning, how do you speak to this camera and not look at that camera? How do you speak to the room and not, fluff it up? But there are also some questions about how do we make sure it works as well as possible? Because if we get this right, if we get out of this long year and have figured out a way that we're not just hermetically sealed in our own, if you like, newsroom and conversation, but we're also able to be, as my grandmother told me was impossible, in two places at once, both digitally and physically, that would be an amazing outcome. So Nico, thank you for your help. Michael Kowalski and John Hill, I saw, jumped on your message, so that would be really helpful. And I know that Connor and Phoebe, who are trying to keep this show on the road, will no doubt pick up on that too. Listen, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you everyone in the room. We're going to keep on plugging away at the arms race. I know Kerry's downstairs working away at Wuhan, and we're definitely going to pick up on what Paul's done today in terms of very local variations, MSOAs. I'm now going to use widely, even though I can't quite remember what it stands for already. Listen, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a very good afternoon. Bye.